introduce tonight's event and the work that we're going to be showing tonight. But I thought I'd give a bit of detail around how this project, these two works came into being. At the end of last year, Tan and myself began a discussion about his writing, his work, with a view to him contributing a new piece of text to one of the booklets that we produce to accompany our exhibition program at Artist Space. These booklets often include excerpted texts and other material from different sources that we compile in relation to an artist's work or a particular project that we're working on. So the conversation with Tan kind of revolved around ideas of intertextuality entered into by artworks and material that is produced around artworks. We discussed also the manner in which online communication and networking platforms absorb and aggregate information and present hybrid forms of identity projection. So Tan subsequently proposed both a printed contribution to the exhibition publication and also two works using PowerPoint as a particular medium which would be hosted initially on the Artist Space website. So the presentation tonight involves a further tier to this work, if you like, in showing these PowerPoint works in a different context from the online context that they've had since earlier this year. Just to give you some brief biographical information on Tan Lin, I'm sure most of you here know Tan very well, so it might be a bit redundant, but Tan Lin is the author of more than 10 books, including Heath, Plagiarism Outsourced from 2009, and 7 Controlled Vocabularies, an Obituary 2004, The Joy of Cooking in 2010. His work has appeared in numerous journals, including Artforum, Cabinet, and the New York Times Book Review, and his video work has screened at the Yale Art Museum, the Drawing Center, and the Ontological Hysterical Theater. So I'll pass over to Tan now, who's going to introduce the kind of structure of tonight's event.
Thank you, Richard. So we're going to do 2 videos tonight. The first one is a bibliographic soundtrack, and it runs 40 minutes, but we're just going to run it for 15 or 16 or 17 minutes, something like that. And I thought, well, if a movie could have a soundtrack, well, maybe a bibliography should be able to have one too. So that was kind of the idea there. And the second piece is called the PhD Sound. And it runs 15 minutes, and Moscow will be DJing that, so there'll be a live musical component to that piece. And Bibliographic Soundtrack has a kind of Perfume soundtrack. So we crowdsourced some perfumes, and they'll be drifting through the space. You may not be able to smell them, though. So, and we'll talk about the perfumes. There'll be a short 20-minute sort of talk in between the videos, and that's it. Okay. So we're going to just talk a little now, but we'll let this the piece run in the background. I've been reading this book by Ian Bogost called How to Do Things with Video Games. And he talks about sort of lean back video games, which induce sort of meditation and relaxation. And so this first thing is kind of about meditation in some ways, and distraction. And the second kind of video game is a sort of lean forward game that induces sort of focused attention and twitchiness. So the second video is more about that, and it has a sort of music track to it. Oh, and I forgot to say this, but you were supposed to keep your cell phones on for this first one, but I forgot to say that.
Do you want to say about the Twitter feed as well, Tan?
What?
The Twitter feed.
Oh, yes. Oh, so we have a Twitter feed up, I think, and I forget our hashtag.
It's PPPT.
So we tried to keep it short, 4 letters, if you want to tweet during the conversation.
Chris, you might need to take the shutter off the projector.
You want me to go ahead and stop the piece?
Just you can pull the shutter off the...
That's it. There's the Twitter feed.
We already have questions. Fantastic.
Any questions?
I'm so great.
Oh, excellent. Maybe I could start with a question, Tan.
Okay.
I guess it's a very straightforward question, really, which is kind of in relation to how you conceive the piece and this iteration here this evening in relation to a kind of collective experience of reading, the specific space of reading that's defined by the projection of the PowerPoint piece rather than the kind of intimacy of how the PowerPoint piece was originally online, and how you've kind of considered this kind of additional tier of adding Perfume, the kind of the additional distraction, if you like, of Perfume to the space, and how that relates to your thinking around the collective experience of reading.
Yeah, so reading often is sort of seen as a highly individualized and solitary experience. So one of the things that we're sort of forcing you to do is to read communally, almost as if it were a sort of cinematic experience. So yeah, so we dim the lights, we give you a chair, and you're not really allowed to move. So solving the problem, that sort of Boris Groys alludes to in Image and Image File, where he says things like, well, the only way you can sort of control time is, to do something cinematic. So there's that element here. Yeah.
I mean, so one of the things that I think is kind of really interesting about PowerPoint is it has like kind of a very fixed design in that when you're creating a PowerPoint, it has to be viewed in a certain way. A PowerPoint...
Can everyone hear?
People hear. A PowerPoint is created to be projected in PowerPoint, and it does dictate the way it's read in a way that, for example, like Microsoft Word or Excel or Outlook don't necessarily dictate the form that the reading of what's created in them will take. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about PowerPoint is that it's a little bit proselytizing. The PowerPoint is designed to convince someone of something, and it's designed to project something on the wall, to show to people, to bring them to your point of view.
So I think clearly playing with that idea, PowerPoint has a sort of logic to it, and what's nice about it, I think, is that it's a kind of seamless presentation when you see it. This is actually not a PowerPoint piece. We filmed it because I was using, I think for nostalgic reasons and economic reasons, PowerPoint 2004. but of course it wouldn't load on any of the artist-based computers, which are more recent than mine. So we actually made a movie, and I think a movie of the piece is sort of different from viewing it as a PowerPoint piece. When you see it as a PowerPoint piece on a browser, we talked quite a bit about this as the piece was uploaded to the Penn Sound site, but when you look at it on a browser and you're looking down, you're sort of in a kind of what sort of neuroscientists call a parapersonal space. And your attention is sort of much more riveted. You control that space that's associated with your body. But when you're looking sort of above a visual horizon, you sort of move into a sort of slightly different space. And this reminds me, I went to see that Doug Wheeler show at Werner, where you put on little slippers and you walked into the room, and the lights blinded you, and you actually lost your sense of yourself. It was kind of like dying and going to heaven. But if you looked above the sort of visual horizon, you got lost. But if you looked down at your feet into the sort of bodily space, you sort of got your bearings again, and you were aware of your body. So I think here, in terms of the PowerPoint thing, well, I like it because it's kind of slick as a medium, and it moves so nicely. The transitions are just so clean. And I think the other thing that's sort of interesting about PowerPoint is, and what I was thinking about when I did this was, well, can you wring a little bit of transcendence out of sort of PowerPoint hell? And also, can you sort of play with just notions of reading? PowerPoint is interesting because it is a sort of multimedia information delivery platform, and it implicates the overhead transparency. In PowerPoint 2, they sort of incorporate slides, so you can make slides with it. And in PowerPoint 3, it begins to incorporate video feeds and also cinematic effects like fade and dissolve. So it's kind of a perfect multimedia platform in which to insert this thing known as poetry. I mean, it's not really a literary medium, and so then it becomes, well, what kind of poem could I write on the PowerPoint platform? I mean, what would it involve? And what sorts of different kinds of reading are there? So, I tried to play here with sort of residual formats that seem to inhere in PowerPoint. One is, of course, the lecture. I actually never saw PowerPoint in a corporate setting, but I did see it when I was at school. And then the other residual form factor, I think, that sort of underlies PowerPoint is just the page. I mean, some people call the individual slides, but sometimes they're called pages. And a lot of the individual frames here, I tried to design so they looked like bibliographic citations, footnotes, and a number of other things, yeah.
I'm just actually considering one of the questions there, which is how many words that suggest themselves don't get in, and I suppose that kind of relates to a question about content, and the PowerPoint works as a kind of aggregator themselves in terms of accumulating content from different sources. So, and it's something that we discussed in relation to the notion of a bibliography and a kind of collation of material in relation to conversations about a specific artist's work. And it never became clear to me as to how much in this process was a kind of process of you passing certain information or creating certain information. How much was appropriative in that sense, and how much was about an aggregator process? Yeah, I think that there's a kind of inherent anthropomorphism in the PowerPoint piece. When you see it, the piece seems to be reading for you. And I'm not sure why that is. I think there is some kind of blurring between, on the one hand, the so-called author or the author function here, PowerPoint, which is sort of literally processing earlier data, and most of it's communications data, so most of this was lifted from sort of temporally directed, time-sensitive material, like Tumblr sites in particular, but also SMS and IM. So there's a lot of recalculation or recalibration by a software platform that sits on top of an operating system, which is taking data from somewhere else and then writing it somewhere else. So the whole notion of a computer reading somehow signifies, oh, it's going to write it somewhere else. So in that sense also, this is not functioning as a book that we sort of sometimes see as a storage medium. This is sort of functioning maybe as an endless transmission medium, what Umberto Eco calls endless semiosis. I don't know if that answered the question, but...
The one thing that you do notice very quickly about your piece is that there's a lot of the content in it is essentially, it's metadata. It's the timestamps from Twitter or from Tumblr. And they've kind of been kind of cut free of the original sources, and they're kind of floating free. And occasionally they become beautiful. And one of the things that strikes me about that is that this is kind of exactly the opposite style of writing that PowerPoint kind of encourages. When one is putting together a PowerPoint, people have the idea that you're putting together a piece of writing that everything has been stripped away from, that everything extraneous has been stripped away. And I think people have the idea that the PowerPoint has a degree 0 of style, that it's just the facts, which of course is not. I mean, PowerPoint does have very much of a style, which is clear here.
Yeah, so I think that there, from a sort of strict PowerPoint perspective, this is a sort of what I would call a weak PowerPoint presentation. It seems to be weak didactically speaking, and it doesn't seem to have a point either. But on the other hand, it's kind of quite minimal. If you read all these manuals about how to do an effective PowerPoint presentation, the call is for a kind of minimalism in terms of, don't use too many of those fancy fades and dissolves. I mean, keep it simple. So in this sense, I found something interesting and quite nice or lovely about PowerPoint in terms of how you could create something that was quite minimal and meditative, and a sort of system of thinking through other material that was primarily mood-based. So there aren't really any sort of emotions working through here. It's more like an endless generation of affects. And the movement of the piece, I think, is sort of not, it's not sort of cognitively driven from the top down in terms of focused attention, but it was more about diffusing attention in a kind of lateral or branching or network manner. And maybe that touches again on some of the things that Richard was talking about earlier in terms of how our moods communicated within a communal viewing space. Here, in some ways this is kind of torture, right? You're forcing quite a few people to sit in a dark room and actually read. I mean, this is normally, at a poetry reading, someone comes up and gives you the words, but here you're going to actually have to try to convince someone to sit down and read text for an extended period of time. But I didn't really, one doesn't want to be sort of, to force people to do too much, so we were hoping to give you some space to get bored and to dilate and look at your cell phone and be distracted. So there should be maybe some space to get out of this too. I don't know if that worked or not. I forgot to tell you to turn on your cell phones.
But I think this is interesting in relation to what we've been hinting at, that PowerPoint has a specific temporality, or the kind of fades and dissolves program into them is a kind of specific time span. But it seems that you're kind of utilizing that as a kind of the kind of spectacular qualities of that, the fact that it's revealing information at a certain speed, but that you're also, my understanding is that the intention is this piece becomes a 10-hour work. So in a sense, it breaks any sense of real attention or real awareness of a kind of whole work, if you like. It's about fragmentation and small fragments of information and how that information is received. But at the same time, you're manipulating the temporality in which it's pushing information to people.
Oh, yeah, to return to the sort of other thing, in terms of how it sort of differs and is the same as PowerPoint. The sort of obvious medium here that I'm working from is a literary medium, and literary mediums typically, I think, repress their medial format. When you read a book, you're not really so much aware that you're working with a book unless you're sort of working in the field of book studies. And then the other thing that's sort of repressed within a literary format is a sort of temporality of reading practices in general. And within a sort of literary context, people have talked about this for a long time. When Stanley Fish, writes that book, Is There a Text in This Class? I think he's explicitly trying to shift the focus from an author to the reader, and also from the book as a static object to sort of temporal processes of reading. So this is sort of about that too. It's really about being very much aware of the sort of underlying medial formats. So there's RSS feeds here, there are text messages, there's some IM things, there are Facebook updates, all these sorts of things that are associated with here, and I'd make some sort of distinction between a communications versus a literary platform, although I'm interested in where those two sort of blur and come together. And then the other thing that the piece sort of reminds you of is this just sort of the temporal element, partially just because the text appears and then is gone. So it doesn't appear to be a storage medium, although this is a film, so it is technically a storage medium. But it's a kind of computational medium as well.
And I think one of the things that's interesting with PowerPoint when you compare it to a book is that PowerPoint does kind of shift the balance of power back from the reader very much to the author, who's very much controlling how the reader is processing the text. I mean, so I think like there is often like this kind of almost this feeling of revulsion around PowerPoint that you don't have around other programs, because it is in a sense manipulative, which I think is interesting. And you think of PowerPoint, and PowerPoint's one of those things that gets used in mega churches where pastors are kind of presenting a sermon on the screen and people can follow along. And which is I don't know, I guess I'm interested in that. It seems like there are two different functions that this piece can have, and when you have a captive audience, you're kind of like a pastor in the church in that you are forcing them to read and to follow along. But when it becomes more ambient, that's another sort of reading entirely. And can the piece do both, or is it?
Maybe that's a question the audience can answer better, but I'm not sure how the piece gets read. I mean, one of the things that I sort of tried to do with the piece is to instigate different kinds of reading methods. I mean, I think reading is incredibly sort of platform specific. One reads in particular genres, and in particular, one reads a novel differently, I think, than a text message. And I was, very interested in kinds of non-reading. Also in terms of this particular PowerPoint thing, there's a lot of left to right reading, but also right to left reading, and bottom to top and top down reading. And one of the things that I was looking at was, I took some poems that I'd written too, but I wrote most of these poems on a Twitter platform. And what's interesting about the Twitter platform is that you write the thing on the top and then it goes down, so that the sort of first line in a poem is actually at the bottom of a Twitter feed. So I think that's sort of interesting chronologically. And one of the things that I was trying to do here was simply instigate a kind of, some sort of reading that hadn't reached the state of reading, but was just a kind of general awareness or perceptual awareness of language popping and moving on a screen. This is a blog, I think. Yeah, this is what I did. This as a blog, and I give my students this assignment all the time. So I ask them to get on Twitter, to start Tumblr, to get on Facebook if they're not already on it, all these sorts of things. And so I asked them to write a blog, and I found that when I got on this blog, I was writing to this person, but I actually didn't know who this person was. But I felt vaguely in love with this person. And so, so it was I was just unsure of who was talking to who here. And I think that's kind of one of the things I was getting at in this piece as well. I mean, it's not really clear who's authoring the piece. Is it PowerPoint, a software program sitting on top of other communications data? Is it the audience? Is it some other author? And most of this material, sort of as Richard alluded to earlier, I didn't write it. It's produced by other people.
Do we have questions there that should be addressed?
I think the question about whether there was
there will be food later. Liquid food though.
And can you maybe say a little bit about, not to want to jump straight now to the second piece, but what's the differentiation between the two works and the process of producing these two works? One is obviously you've decided in this context to have a perfume soundtrack, and the other one's more about kind of ambient soundtrack. But what is in terms of the content and the production?
I think in some ways they're similar because they're both an attempt to sort of expand the sort of frame of reading into a sort of environmental space. In one case, a space controlled by music, and in another case, a space controlled or decontrolled or disaggregated by smell and fragrance. So in that sense, the two pieces are similar. But I think the first piece is kind of more difficult. It's more meditative. It's harder to get in. It reminds me of sort of that state of kensho that you can reach in a meditative state, which is sort of grounded in allotropic forms of bottoms-up attention. But it's, I'm not a sort of new agey person, and I think that the sort of notion of kensho is something that's actually difficult and may take decades to get at. The second thing, which we're about to show, has a musical soundtrack, and Richard had asked me to do a text for a show at Artist Space in March. And there was a duo called Duox, and I didn't know anything about them. So, and their exhibition history was relatively short, right? So I couldn't get much of them on the internet, and I couldn't find any written stuff. So Richard and Amy were feeding me tons of research material. I knew that their stuff had to do with commodity status of, and particularly mass customization. So I did a huge amount of research. So the second piece, which you're about to see, is really the research record. It's all the stuff I would have read if I were to write a critical essay on Duox, which I never wrote. And yeah, it's a bibliography. I mean, I did a PhD at Columbia, and after 5 years or so, bibliographies start to look kind of sexy. So we did try to make this one kind of sexy. Maybe we should just show it now.
It's definitely
all right.
sexy.
Okay, so we'll show this, and we've got some live music from Moscow.
Yeah.